Our next presentation is by David Richard on the topic of torture in the time of COVID. Now, since August 2010, David has been an associate professor of human rights and political science at the University of Connecticut. He has authored official reports for the US National Intelligence Council and the Human Rights Council, and has written widely on human rights, specifically with regard to torture, physical integrity, sexual violence, and women's rights. And his most recent book is Violence Against Women and the Law by Routledge in 2015. Today, David will talk to us about a very topical, maybe underreported aspect of the COVID situation, namely how the right to be free from torture and ill treatment has been compromised in the wake of this crisis, and how this affects people's ability to live with dignity. And he will show us how the public health and economic crisis, both as a twin crisis, caused by the pandemic, have contributed to the situation. David, the floor is yours.
Oh, good morning. Good. I'm really humbled to have a couple minutes of your time this morning. One thing I'd like to say is that I hope we can all take a moment today to reflect on our privilege of being well enough in the middle of a pandemic to participate in this event. There's so much going on around us that is glad to see so many people doing well. To the talk, at University of Connecticut, for some time I've taught a course on torture at the undergrad and graduate level. And I was doing so last spring. And I had a lot of information coming at me about things happening in the world. And I wanted to kind of start thinking about how to take this information in and assemble it into a framework that started to make some sense about what was happening in terms of the dynamics of the pandemic. And so, what I have today is kind of some notes from a think piece of trying to think systematically about how the pandemic is affecting torture and ill treatment. And so it's far from, anything finished, but it is something that, I'm trying to structure thought with. So I'm going to attempt to share a PowerPoint presentation with you. All right, hopefully this is working, and this way you have some pictures and you don't have to stare at me for 15 minutes. I need to acknowledge my other contributor on this, and that's Professor Ronald Galaney at the University of Akron, who's written with me in the past on a lot of different human rights issues, and it's terrific to have Ron on board for this. Okay. In May 2020, 3 women, including a member of parliament, were arrested in Zimbabwe for protesting on behalf of those who'd been negatively affected by the COVID-related lockdown. These women were disappeared, and during that time they were beaten, sexually assaulted, and actually forced to drink one another's urine. After 2 days, they were found dumped in a marketplace and requiring hospitalization for their injuries. After the UN called for the, as they said, perpetrators of the outrageous crime to be prosecuted, the women were actually rearrested for lying, supposedly, about being tortured in custody. In April, 10 Ugandan police officers were charged with torture after reportedly caning 38 women and making them swim in mud. That same month, the Office of the UN High Commission for Human Rights gave a virtual briefing citing South African police's use of whips, tear gas, rubber bullets, and water bombs to enforce social distancing. In March, protests by prisoners in Iran's Shaiban prison over COVID-19 safety concerns resulted in torture and ill treatment, including severe beatings, the firing of metal pellets at prisoners' heads, and the long-term housing of multiple prisoners in solitary confinement cells. In the USA, the state of Connecticut's Department of Corrections began quarantining COVID-19 positive prisoners at Northern Correctional Institution. This was found to be a violation of constitutional protections against cruel and unusual treatment. And notably, it drew a rebuke from UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Meltzer. So all these foregoing examples of torture and ill treatment, directly or indirectly, are products of the COVID pandemic. And, you know, while pandemics and natural disasters are well-known disruptors of states, you know, economic growth and stability, certainly we've seen nothing as in modern times what the COVID crisis has unleashed. And it's seen the institution of policies, you know, lockdowns, aggressive enforcement policies, the tightening of immigration controls, economic austerity programs, changes in the, you know, observance of international minimum standards of prison conditions and prisoner care. And these policies have really directly or indirectly been responsible for torture and ill treatment. In taking on this topic at this time, we really find ourselves at an interesting juncture, because we're at a time where so much clear harm has occurred that the relationship between the pandemic and torture and ill treatment has to be given serious attention. But not a lot of time has passed, you know, since the onset of the pandemic, that there's a lot of data to available this in any kind of, you know, systematic or nomothetic fashion. In the think piece, there's two basic questions. One, how to this point has the pandemic affected torture and ill treatment? And two, I think the question that's on so many people's minds about so much about the pandemic is, well, what's going to persist after the pandemic itself, you know, hopefully finally ceases. Now, there's a lot of ways to think about the pandemic, and I decided to kind of draw a map. And this map kind of forms the guidance for the paper. And so we have the pandemic, and the pandemic's unleashed at least two dual crises. We've got an economic crisis and a public health crisis. The economic crisis has seen protests as a result, which has brought repression. We've seen many different kind of forms of prison labor. The public health crisis has also affected the onset of prison labor, particularly in the United States. The public health crisis has certainly, you know, shown quarantines and lockdowns, and this has led to a lot of attention to violence against women and girls. It's also brought protests, which have brought repression. We've seen excessive use and enforcement of different public policies surrounding quarantines. We've seen a lot of things about people in physical custody, exposure to the virus, other minimum conditions, solitary confinement in the United States, as has come up in the last several weeks. Many things happening at ICE facilities, that's immigration control. And also, one of the things that hasn't been talked about as much is that as travel's been restricted, the ability to monitor human rights violations and to study human rights through interviews and other ground field-oriented manners has been prevented as these travel restrictions happen. Today, since I'm just going to try to get through to talk about these paths, the paper is getting a little longish at this point, so I'm not going to try to even hit everything. So torture, ill treatment, just to kind of start, it has at least, you know, has a substantive and attributive character to it. We'll look first at the substantive character, that is, what is torture? It is a non-derogatory human right, that is, no derogation is allowed in times of states of emergency. It's a jus cogens, it's a peremptory, inviolable norm of international law. The most important global instrument is the 84 UNCAT, the Convention Against Torture. And it's one of many, you know, there's 8 regional treaties that address torture. There's other global international instruments, but this is the central instrument. Article 1 is 4 elements, the act, and that is any act by which severe pain or suffering, physical or mental. It's got a mens rea, right, is intentionally inflicted on a person. It has a list of enumerated purposes, right? And this is important. Not all definitions of torture in international instruments have enumerated purpose lists, but this one does. for such purposes, obtaining from him or third person information or confession, punishing for an act he or a third person has committed or suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person for any reason based on discrimination, and the involvement of a public official. And also, again, UNCAT has this qualification about the involvement of a public official. Not all international instruments relating to torture do. And so here we have the consent or acquiescence of a public official, or cover of law also is invoked for that as well. So we have Article 16 also that sets up a category for acts that are impermissible but are less than torture in some way. And one could actually spend a whole semester trying to figure out the difference between Article 1 violations and Article 16 violations. Lots of courts have spent lots of their lives talking about that. But here we have cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, which do not amount to torture. The Committee Against Torture has noted that, in comparison to torture, this may differ in the severity of pain and suffering. It doesn't usually require proof of impermissible purposes. They've also enumerated certain methods over time to constitute this, such as restraining in very painful conditions, hooding, sounding of loud music for prolonged periods, sleep deprivation, threats, violent shaking, cold air. These in combination might constitute torture, but alone they're in Article 16. It's not less permissible than torture, but it is a different category. And again, the politics of the convention when they put this together are really interesting and not germane to what we're talking about right now. So the attributive character, that is, who can be held accountable for torture. The pathways to COVID-connected torture and ill treatment discussed in this paper bring into play at least 3 attributive scenarios. One, there's state torture. So for example, 2 Colombian police officers violently detained citizen Javier Ordóñez. They immobilized him and they shot him with electric taser X2 guns for allegedly not complying with certain isolation regulations due to the COVID pandemic. Once he was immobilized and not posing any danger to the officers whatsoever, they continued to apply direct shots to his body for approximately 5 minutes. Ordóñez asked them to stop, as did witnesses who were recording the incident from close by. He died in a hospital hours later. That's direct state action. We might see private torture with a state linkage to the act. The Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia, the United States, is run by a private company called LaSalle Corrections. This facility knowingly placed detainees who were at risk of contracting the virus and has been demonstrating gross disregard for health and safety standards, lack of medical care, and unsanitary living conditions. You might have private torture with no state linkage to the act. So here's a story from El Salvador. We used the name Zoila. Zoila fell fast for the soft-spoken day labor. She moved in with him real quick when the pandemic started. But when El Salvador imposed a strict coronavirus lockdown, the man that she thought she knew became an inescapable menace. And the quarantine changed everything, she said. Shut inside their one-room house in rural El Salvador, he began drinking heavily, regularly violating the coronavirus curfew and seeing other women openly. He'd return home at odd hours, wake her and demand meals. Drunk, he'd taunt the pregnant Zoila, calling her worthless and threatening violence. And then one morning, she says he grabbed her by the throat, slammed her against the wall, and attempted to rape her. When she resisted, she said the punching began, stopping only when fluid began trailing down her leg, and she was screaming, fearing a miscarriage. And certainly that's private torture with no state linkage to the act. Now, we'll look at these different things. We'll take a look at the protest paths first. The global COVID pandemic's created an environment that's really conducive to protests, both in response to the economic crisis and government-mandated quarantines, as well as social restrictions. these protests can lead to torture or ill treatment. Now, that's not to say that, you know, the context of 2020 has been necessarily facilitative of social movements. Since the start of the pandemic, many states have implemented suspensions of human rights, such as the right to assemble. The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law has a list of right now 126 countries who are having measures that affect assembly that were enacted in response to the COVID pandemic. It's a very interesting list that they've compiled. Now, that said, after an initial latent period during the uncertainty of the beginning of the pandemic, you know, activists in Chile, Ecuador, Greece, Hong Kong, Israel, and Lebanon returned to the streets before the lockdowns ended. We see two paths, two kind of ways that protest activity could be looked at. First, there might be response to policy protests, and there might be response to violence protests. And I'll give you a couple of examples of each. A response to policy scenarios, one where you've got a pandemic-related law, regulation, or order, and people protest this directly. It might be direct, a protest in response to a new or expanded lockdown order, or indirect, right? There might be a business hardship or something brought on by loss of business because of the lockdown, and then people protest against that. Serbia is a good example of this, the response to policy situation. On June 21st, ahead of elections, President Vučić greatly loosened Serbia's really restrictive pandemic-based health regulations. And in early July, he announced that new restrictions would have to be imposed due to increasing cases. So people started protesting because he let them loose and then he put the restrictions back down after the elections. In Belgrade, police beat several journalists, both private ones and those working for the state news agency, with batons. These attacks came after the journalists had been identified as such. Some people have actually said that these protests weren't related to COVID, but were related to kind of Serbians being fed up with corruption. But you know, if other factors like corruption provided an original motive, the global COVID pandemic undoubtedly provided the opportunity. And so what we've been seeing in these protests is something called frame bridging. And frame bridging is a kind of intentional intersectionality where people combine agendas to increase the efficacy of activism. And we've seen a lot of these protests throughout the world using frame bridging, where they'll sew together pre-existing kind of complaints with complaints about maintenance of the COVID regime in their country. And we've seen these in Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Spain, and other places. I'll go through this as time is limited. Again, response to violence means that a state actor first commits an act of violence. Typically, it's police where that happens. So we have a case from Mexico. This is the laborer Giovanni Lopez. He was arrested by police on May 4th for not wearing a mask. He was held in a police facility and the next day died of a traumatic brain injury. He was also found shot through the foot. A Human Rights Commission investigated the death, concluding he was knowingly and disproportionately beaten by police officers and died as a result of these injuries. And by beating him on reported occasions, committed acts of torture. Now, the torture and death of Lopez was really widely known and subsequently produced protests in Guadalajara, the city that was nearby Lopez's town. And the protests were marred by violence on all sides. I mean, the demonstrators were torching police cars and vandalizing the government palace. They lit one police officer on fire. The police beat and arbitrarily detained protesters, including plainclothes police that had sticks, bats, and pipes, and carted demonstrators away in unmarked pickup trucks. And the Mexican Federal Interior Department released a statement saying that the strong COVID-related measures by the Jalisco state governor directly contributed to the protest violence. So you had kind of the federal level of government actually saying that the state level of government brought this kind of upon themselves because of the strict COVID restrictions. I have some other examples in the paper, but I want to clean up here real quick. Violence against women and girls. As UN Women has said towards the pandemic start, there are a lot of reasons why we might expect to see increased violence against women and girls as kind of money worries, heightened health security worries and strains. These are accentuated by cramped and confined living conditions. Women have a less ability to escape and to seek services in shelters for the crimes being committed against them. And early on in the pandemic, I mean, people knew this was coming. The UN did a survey of Palestinian women towards the beginning of the pandemic, and 1/3 of them expected increased domestic violence due to changes that were coming because of the pandemic, although there's stories around the world about that. We've seen a lot of different experiences around the world that, have seen various increases in calls at shelters and call centers throughout the world, 25%, 150%. It varies from place to place. There's no kind of consistent number, that you could say in the world, this many percent of women more than last year were, calling call centers. So it's very varied. There's so much we don't know because while we know a lot about gendered impacts of conflicts and natural disasters, infectious disease epidemics are less understood greatly. And even in research looking at this, we know that violence against women is underreported, right? One study of almost, more than 250,000 women found that only about 7% disclosed to formal sources. And the dominant way of getting a lot of this information is interviewing people, which can't happen right now because of the pandemic. And there's a lot of contradictory data, right? There's one kind of meta study that looked at 12 very scientifically rigorous surveys of call centers. And there's just no consistency globally as to the experience. Are women, calling in more, calling in less? Are there more reports of sexual violence? Are there less reports of sexual violence? In the paper, try to kind of make some sense of this, but there's no consistent story right now. The evidence is very different looking across geography. And so, looking ahead into the future, this quote kind of came to mind to me in terms of what we might expect from governments as we leave this, what we might expect from abusive partners as we leave this, certainly we don't know a whole lot right now. But like I said, so I think that felt like a commercial for the paper. That was my 20-minute commercial for the paper, and hopefully we can finish it up soon and get it out there for people to read in a full manner. And I appreciate your time so much. Thank you.